Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College, the University of Oxford. Now, some of you will have the LNAT test coming up. That stands for the Law National Admissions Test. It's a bit of a stinker. This particular video is going to be on the Section B essay. If you want any tips and advice on the Section A multiple choice questions, check out my video on that, which I will link up here somewhere. But this is going to be on the essay, which is the second half of the exam. I say second half, it's actually not half because you only have 40 minutes for the essay, whereas you have 95 minutes for the multiple choice questions. But this video will also be of use to any of you who are just writing lots of essays and you want a bit of help in how to tackle it and how to stand out from the crowd. So let's dive in with the LNAT essay. First of all, we ought to discuss some top tips just for the LNAT more generally. And this is a bit of a rehashing, revising of what I say in my other video on the LNAT, but the 3 P's of preparation that I want you to consider are physiological, psychological, and practical. Physiological preparation meaning that the LNAT is a difficult test, very difficult. It's demanding, it requires quite a lot of intellectual stamina. It's not necessarily a test of brains, it's more of a test of resilience and perseverance. And so physiological preparation means making sure you're well slept, making sure that you are well watered, hydrated, and making sure that you're well fed in advance of the exam. If you are feeling drained, the test is going to drain you very fast. So making sure that you are just well prepared in body will help you in mind. That's the first P. The second P, psychological preparation. It is a stinker of a test. It is hard. It is challenging. So don't go into it finding it difficult and thinking that's because there's something the matter with you. There absolutely isn't. You just have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. When you find it hard, it's because the test is hard. It's not because there's anything wrong with you. Don't psych yourself out and say, I'm not Oxbridge material, I'm not Russell Group material, whatever. Don't neg yourself. It's not going to help. Just keep moving forward. It's a test about resilience, really. Third P, practical. Practice, practice, practice. The more you can get through practice papers, the better you'll get. If you run out of LNAT tests of practice, you can practice on the US LSATs, LSATs, which are relatively similar, certainly for Section A. Okay, so do check out my other video on that, but we're going to be focusing more in this video on the essay. So just generally some essay top tips. So this is not pertaining to the LNAT specifically, but more widely. Be sure to answer the question you are asked. This is one of the most common problems that we see in submitted essays at university level and for admissions tests like the LNAT, is that students don't directly answer the question. They maybe sit on the fence, they maybe answer a different question that they feel more comfortable tackling, they may want to say that the question posed has some fundamental flaw in it and therefore they're not willing to answer it. All of those, I'm afraid, are mistakes. If you've been asked a question, it's because the readers expect an answer. And you need to think of yourself as a lawyer. You know, if you had a lawyer who was going to defend you in court, you wouldn't want them to go up to the pleading bar and say to judge and jury, I kind of don't know if they're not guilty, because, yeah, I'm sort of on the fence. You know, that would be a disaster, wouldn't it? You'd fire them as your lawyer straight away. So you need to visualize yourself as a lawyer writing any essay, which is that you are going to defend a particular line robustly, and that line is going to be absolutely determined by the question. You're not going to deviate from the question, you're going to answer the question, the whole question, and nothing but the question that you have been posed. It's very important, okay? You also need to structure your answer. If you just fire off ideas all over the place, oh, I've got this point, I've got that point, it's a big old mess, then it's going to be very difficult to understand your case and how it's put together. We want a nice thread that connects introduction to conclusion with some points that all connect to the thread so that it's logical, that it's sequential, that we can follow your line of reasoning in a very clear and accessible manner. Okay? What you don't want is a sort of stream of consciousness where you're just allowing ideas to pour forth. And that therefore fundamentally means you have to plan your essays. If you fail to plan, you should plan to fail. It really is as simple as that, okay? One device that I will demonstrate for helping to structure your answers is to find what I call the hook words of the question. I will discuss that a bit later. It's also worth noting that the LNAT essay is, in particular, testing your argumentation, not your knowledge. And indeed, that is more broadly true of essay writing at university. My experience is that we're not just testing, have you learned the facts and are you able to regurgitate them faithfully? But we are testing whether you have the skill to put forth those facts in a meaningful way. Okay, one of the things that sometimes people find difficult in the transition from school to university is that at school you're often rewarded for being good at just memorizing facts, whereas at university it's more about how you use those facts in order to create a viable case. Okay, and finally, you need to make sure that you write clearly. If it's difficult to understand what you're trying to say because you've used very long sentences with lots of subordinating clauses and lots of semicolons and lots of just complication, then people will give up. They won't necessarily give you the benefit of the doubt. Aim for short sentences with mostly short words. Don't overcomplicate. Don't try and pretend to be someone you're not, writing in a very flowery register. Nice, clear, simple sentences, relatively sort of short paragraphs, although not sort of single sentence paragraphs, will all be to everyone's benefit. Okay, moving on. What have we got next? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 3 past essay questions for the LNAT. I'm going to start by setting out how I would plan the first one. Then for the second one, I'll give you a little bit less guidance. And for the third one, I'll give you no guidance whatsoever. And I'd like to see you come up with your own plans and drop them in the comments. And I'll give some feedback if I'm able to. Okay, so for the first plan, plan A, we're going to be talking about this question: make the best case you can for public funding of the arts. Make the best case you can for public funding of the arts. So let's go through my plan and its details, and then we can discuss a template that you might be able to apply more generally to lots of questions. And then we can see a sample that the LNAT people have provided for you to look through. Okay, so starting off, what is the hook word of this question? Now, the hook word is the word or phrase or words that you need to focus on throughout your essay. And if you don't focus on it, then you're not answering the question. And the way to identify that is to try and answer the question with as few words as possible, and the hook words will inevitably come out. So make the best case you can for public funding of the arts. Well, this isn't framed as a question, but if I was to answer this as quickly as possible, I would say something like, the best case is blah. And so the words best case are the hook of this question. It's what we're going to have to hang our answers off. And it's therefore what we need to focus all of our attention on. And I would expect someone writing an essay on this to use the phrase best case quite a lot, actually, in order to really hammer home that they are focused on the question, the whole question, and nothing but the question. Okay, so in the introduction, I would answer, I would respond straight away, and that's what you should do in the introduction. I mean, ideally in the opening lines, don't mess around. The tutors are going to be reading these essays rather fast, they've got to get through quite a lot. If you hold their hand and you help them out, if you make it clear from the first instance what it is you're trying to argue, what you're trying to get across, what you're trying to convince them of, it will stand you in very good stead. What the tutors don't want to be doing is sort of trying to figure out, what's this person trying to say? I don't fully understand it. Again, going back to framing your activities as being like a lawyer, if you go up to the pleading bar of a court and you say all sorts of things that are not relevant to whether or not your client is guilty or not guilty, judge and jury are going to get confused very fast. So hit it straight out. This is what I would respond to the question. So in my case, I would say something like, the best case is that the arts are good for society and that they flourish with public funding. So that's the best case, is that it's good for society, okay, fundamentally. The next paragraph, I would want to define some key terms. I could do this fairly briefly, but there's a lot of ambiguity in pretty much every essay question. There's a lot of phrases and terms that could do with unpacking. And so in this instance, it's things like what public versus private funding even means, why we might not just allow the market to determine where money goes to the arts. And indeed, the term arts, I think, is ambiguous. Does that apply to fine art, ballet, cinema, sports? Seems a bit of a stretch potentially. So we might want to get a bit of a grip on what these words mean. You could obviously spend most of the essay just defining your terms, and that wouldn't be terribly helpful. But what you're trying to do is just get a grip on them, get a grip on those concepts. Just like, again, as a lawyer, you would have to get a grip on any key terminology around which the argument between both sides will be focused. So whether or not it's the concept of guilt, whether or not it's the concept of negligence, these terms are basically the foundations of everything else that will come after them. Every part of the argument. So you've got to get some grip on that. You don't necessarily need to be confident that you have said the final word on what arts means, because that ain't going to happen. But what you can do is at least just demonstrate some eagerness to take control of what you think the words can mean in this context. Okay. Following on from defining terms, I would have basically 2 points that are interconnected. You've only got 40 minutes. You're expected to write about 500-600 words. I think 2 points is pretty much realistic. You may be able to stretch to a third, but you don't need to go crazy. It's not the number of points that matters anyway. More important is that those points are sequential, that they link together. What we don't want is random point, unconnected. We want a flow, we want a structure, a logic to it. So what I might start off with is to say that the best case part 1 is what could be described as instrumental utility. So instrumental meaning that public funding of the arts leads to some consequence which is desirable, that there is a good return on that investment, and there's studies that suggest as much. Now, if you are not aware of any such studies, that's fine. Remember, it's not a test of knowledge, but it's not particularly controversial to suggest that if you fund certain arts and they then make money, more money than you put into them, then that is prima facie a pretty good reason to publicly fund the arts. You just make a profit, for want of a better word. Okay, but that's not the best case. I think a stronger case is part 2, which links to that return on investment, which is that more generally, there's an intrinsic utility to publicly funding the arts. So instrumental utility means that you do something because it'll have a good consequence. But intrinsic utility is that you do something because it's good in itself. It's not a means to an end, it's the end in itself. And public funding of the arts is good because it improves democracy and cultural health. In other words, I could argue that art is it's a pressure valve, it's a release for societies to discuss certain core concepts and to throw around certain ideas and to develop forms of participation and discourse besides just the political process, that you can get art that challenges societies and makes them think, it makes them flourish, it encourages diversity of thought, all of which are tremendously important for healthy societies. So that, I would say, is my sort of best case, is that it has intrinsic utility. And it links to the first point, because if you're funding the arts, you're not necessarily going to lose money, and even more importantly, you're going to be making society more healthy in the process. Okay, so that's my best case. I do, after that, need to have a bit of a paragraph dealing with caveats or counter-arguments. Now, this is because we want to demonstrate some balance, but without sitting on the fence. Now, sitting on the fence would be to say, well, on the other hand, maybe we shouldn't publicly fund the arts. That's too weak. That's like saying, well, maybe on the other hand, my client is guilty all along, and don't know, maybe they should go to prison. That's no good. What we do want to do, however, is to show sensitivity, to show that we are aware of what other people may be thinking, and why, with respect, we would say we're not going to go along with that line of thought. And so I might, for example, talk about, well, you could, in fact, waste a lot of money publicly funding the arts. That is highly plausible. And indeed, you might end up funding propaganda. You might end up funding things that are just helping governments to manipulate their populations. And so the public funding component could be potentially dangerous. Okay, and then the final paragraph would be conclusions, where you just reiterate your answer. Even if you've been saying it over and over, just say it again, okay, just so that everyone is clear. The best case for funding the arts is because it will return on investment and it's healthy for society. But then I'll also draw out some implications, which might be something along the lines of, so even in tough times, we ought to sustain funding of the arts. We could even potentially argue that in the toughest of times, even when there are all sorts of pressures on the public purse strings, we should increase public funding of the arts, as eccentric a notion as that might seem, because it will help society with its health and also can return on investment. Now, these are controversial arguments, and they can be critiqued, of course, but I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to draw a line in the sand, because I don't want to be sitting on a fence awkwardly, because I'm not going to convince anyone if I do that. Okay, so let's sort of have a think about what the template is that we've roughly used here. Now, quick health warning, although I'm giving you what could be utilized as a very basic essay template, What I'm not suggesting is that writing at university level ought to be formulaic. Indeed, that's one of the problems we sometimes have helping students navigate the shift from school to university, is that they might be a little bit fixated on what's the formula for writing a good essay. But this is a fairly uncontroversial and very basic sort of template that I think could work, certainly in this context. You need an introduction which must answer the question. You ought to define some of the key terms in the question. You ought to have at least 2 points that connect together. You ought to have a paragraph that deals with caveats or counter-arguments, and you ought to have a conclusion that again answers the question and draws out some implications. That sort of structure, I think, can work, and you can fit in the specifics for any particular question around that basic template. Okay, now LNAT have helpfully provided a sample answer to this question, so we can have a look at it and we can have a think about its strengths and weaknesses. So what I've got here is the introduction and the conclusion. We'll go through each and just discuss some of the things that we can see here. Now I'm half blind, so I'm going to have to really lean in, so just so you're aware. There are two main worries about public funding of the arts. One is that there seem nowadays to be so many more urgent calls on public money. Isn't public funding for the arts an unaffordable luxury? The second worry is that there seem to be so many other things that are similar to the arts, but that do not attract similar public funding. Are the arts being picked out for special privilege, perhaps thanks to snobbery? I will try to show why, in spite of these worries, the arts remain a deserving case for some public funding. Now, that's fine as an introduction, but what we don't get is a clear line of argument. What I would expect from an introduction is an actual thesis statement, a statement of this is the case I'm going to make. It's saying that they are going to make a case, but it doesn't sort of give the fundamentals of that case. And so I'd want a little bit more information. Obviously, you don't want the introduction to just give away the whole punchline, but something that at least gives a clearer steer on how they're going to argue, and also gives a bit of a roadmap, tells us how they're going to structure their points, would be really helpful to a reader so that they can anticipate how the essay is going to proceed. They also, I think, crucially don't use the phrase best case, and that's the hook of this question, and I would really expect as an examiner to see the term best case in someone that I thought was being focused and disciplined in responding to the question. So this is fine as an introduction, but I think it could be better with some very minor tweaks, and those minor tweaks would actually really significantly improve it, to my mind. Okay, then the conclusion. This argument seems to assume that a time will come when we will miss the arts or sports we have lost. That may not be true. Few people miss Morris dancing, a nearly dead art, or jousting, a nearly dead sport. But suppose we lost all dance-related arts or all performance arts. Suppose we lost all combat sports or all dangerous sports. Then we will live in a world with fewer choices and fewer opportunities for human beings to excel and develop their abilities, as well as for other human beings to spectate and admire this development. One important job for governments, even if it is never urgent, is to keep a wide variety of arts and sports alive for the future, so that the future is at least as full of interesting options as the present. So something to note about that is that it draws out the implications of the argument as to what we ought to do in the future. It is also plainly written. The sentences are reasonably short, they're manageable. The words are short. There are few 3-syllable words there, which is to be praised. That's a good thing. It's easy basically to grasp what they're trying to say. I'm not sure it's necessarily the strongest argument, because they say at the start, we don't miss Morris dancing, we don't miss jousting, but it sort of speculates, well, we ought to keep alive certain activities, arts and sports for the future. It's also slightly confusing why they're conflating art and sport, and whether or not they think sport is somehow artistic. I guess it can be, but should it be contained? They didn't have a definitions section in the essay, so I don't know why they're including art and sport together. So there are definitely some strengths to this. I can see why it's a useful sample essay, but again, just some pretty simple changes would have actually really significantly changed and improved it, I would argue. Okay, so plan B, I'm going to give a bit less of a steer on, so that you can think a bit more about how you might approach it, but I will give some guidance. So let's plug in the question. The question is, does it matter if some animal and plant species die out? We're going to plug that into the template that I gave you earlier. So the template starts with an introduction and an answer. And we ought to identify the hook word. So does it matter if some animal and plant species die out? Now remember, the hook can be identified by trying to answer the question with as few words as possible. So yes, it does matter. No, it does not matter. That word matter instantly floats to the surface. So that is the hook word. So we need to get a real grip on the word matter. We need to define it. So what does matter mean? Matter to whom? Matter to what? We're going to have then a follow-up paragraph defining terms. So the terms in the question that are kind of ambiguous would include matter, as mentioned. Even some, it asks us, does it matter if some animal and plant species die out? Well, that begs the question, how many is some? If we're talking one or two, then that's probably not going to matter as much as, several thousand species. Also, which species, if it is a species that supports whole ecosystems, then that will be much more impactful than if it was an apex predator, for example, that could die out and not really have a huge impact potentially. I mean, it depends on context, right? So some is a little bit nebulous. Now, again, you could dwell a lot on defining terms. You don't need to do that for too long. But what you do want to do is to just demonstrate sensitivity to the complexity of language, to its ambiguity, to the need to just get a bit of a grip on it. And then we could even divert ourselves to talk about what animal and plant species are. I'm not sure that's entirely necessary, but it's clearly excluding fungi and microbes. Presumably, this author of the question doesn't care if certain fungi go extinct or certain microbes, but that could be really dangerous in some instances. Anyway, let's not divert ourselves for too long. Now, point 1 and point 2, what would you include in that? Obviously, you've got to consider whether you think it does or does not matter. So you've got to be aligned by that. I think, again, you could use my sort of instrumental intrinsic approach to this, that we could say whether or not it matters for us as a species, and that's the instrumental utility. In other words, if a plant or an animal species dies out, would that lead to some consequence that will rebound on us? So if, for example, honeybees die out, and they are crucial pollinators for certain crops, then we will lose a lot of foodstuffs that we rely on currently for our nutritional needs. So that has a consequence. It is an instrumental problem, so it matters for us, okay? But point 2 could be the intrinsic utility, that it matters to us. It matters in what it says about us as a species, as the custodians of this ecosystem, simply by dint of being the most powerful creatures. What does it mean for our sense of self if we allow certain animal and plant species to die out on our watch? So it's not because it has some direct consequence for us, but it's just because it's kind of a problem in and of itself, right? So it's not a means to an end, it's an end in itself. So I quite like that sort of two-part structure, the instrumental and the intrinsic utility arguments, but that is not the only way to do it. It would be a good idea to have a think about it for yourself. We're going to engage in some counter-arguments where it maybe doesn't matter, because I'm clearly sort of leaning more towards it does matter. And then we'd have some conclusions, which answers the question again, and some implications. Okay, so if there are implications, if I'm saying it does matter, then maybe we need to divert ourselves more into supporting species from coming back from the brink of extinction, for example. Okay, now plan C, I'm not going to give you any steer on this whatsoever, and I would love to see as many examples that you can come up with in the comments, and I will endeavour to read them and give some feedback if you do so. So the question is, should the law require people to vote in general elections? Should the law require people to vote in general elections? The only input I'll give you on this is that it is required in Belgium and Australia for citizens to vote. If they don't, they get fined, in Australia at least. So it is required. That is, of course, not the case in the United Kingdom and the United States, where you are at liberty not to vote. You're not required to vote. It's not against the law to not cast a ballot. Okay, so have a think about how you would tackle this. Maybe use the template, maybe use some of the approaches I've used. Try and identify the hook word here. If you had to answer this question with as few words as possible, what sort of words tend to float to the surface? Have a think about that. Make sure you use those words a lot in your plan and see how you get along. And I'll try and help if you drop anything in the comments. So just some final thoughts on the LNAT essay. what should you do next? I think a good way to prepare for the LNAT essay is to read around various sort of publications, so things like newspapers or journals. You listen to podcasts, watch YouTube lectures, anything where there's sort of moral debates. You don't want anything that's too sort of biased, or you want something that considers the shades of grey, that considers the nuance, but comes up with a really convincing argument. Because that's always the most powerful argument. It's the one where you judiciously weigh up the different pros and cons, you think about them critically, and you come to a conclusion. And that's what I've been trying to suggest here, that yes, we have a clear and robust answer in the introduction. Yes, we have a clear and robust answer in the conclusion. But throughout the essay, we're not just going to be hectoring our audience and say, you've got to be a fool not to agree with me. We go through the points logically and sequentially. We're assuming they're not going to agree with us. We even give a space to consider the counter arguments that they might still be holding on to in order to break them. Okay? A good example of something that you could listen to is The Moral Maze on BBC Sounds. Absolutely superb series. It's been running for yonks, and just really good back and forth between various presenters and guests on moral conundrums. Okay? And finally, how are you supposed to stand out in an LNAT essay? Honestly, if you have a clear answer, well structured, that considers counter arguments but doesn't get waylaid, nice and focused on the question, then you're going to stand out. You can, if you want to go to the next level, make your life a little bit harder. You can choose a line of argument that's more analytically difficult, basically. And one way to think about that is to just pick a side that is typically counterintuitive. So for example, on the question whether or not it matters if plant or animal species die out, most people's intuitions would be to argue it does matter. But you could make your life a little bit harder by basically deciding you're going to argue that it does not matter. And you could find a way to work backwards from that conclusion. Because what is not going to happen is that you are going to be interrogated on your actual beliefs. All we're looking for is to test your skills of argumentation. So you could approach the LNAT essay as a little bit like a debate where someone just says, here, you've got to argue this line of argument. Doesn't matter what you think, just give it a try. And as lawyers, you will be asked to do that quite a lot. You'll be told, here's a client, they need this outcome, go and get it for them. You're not necessarily going to be asked, do you agree with that outcome? Okay, that's kind of irrelevant in many cases. So if you make your life a little bit harder by arguing, it doesn't matter if animals and plant species die out, then that can help you stand out. The risk, and there is a very big risk with this, is that you say something that's indefensible. Okay, that you say something that is downright monstrous, that you sort of and therefore totally unconvincing. And that's the ultimate problem with an argument like that. It's weak. So if you are going to argue something that's slightly controversial, slightly contrarian, it needs to be robust. And that's where you show off your skills to the highest heights. You've got to think about your audience as being inclined not to agree with you. So you don't want to be sort of overconfident and say, it doesn't matter if animals don't die out and you should agree with me. You've got to really handhold and get people to that position with you. You could talk about how, animals and plant species dying out is a part of nature. It was catalogued by Charles Darwin as a crucial driver of evolution, that if we try and sustain species that perhaps without our intervention would have died out, then we could be manipulating ecosystems inappropriately. Sure, we might be contributing very much to species loss but on account of our actions, but trying to prevent them dying out does not matter, and you can figure out how it does not matter. Do you see what I mean? So that is one way to stand out, but it's not the way. It's just an option you might want to consider. Anyway, I hope that all makes sense. Do let me know in the comments if you'd like any help with any of this, and good luck with the test if you're taking it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye now.